Good morning, Sue. If you're trying to speak, Sue, we are not yet hearing you. And now you have an open microphone.
Talk.
We can hear you, Sue. So while we're waiting to get started, if anybody would like to test their microphone, now is a great time. We'll be getting started at 5 after the hour. Let's give everybody a chance to trickle in.
You hear me?
We can hear you, Sue. And also to give everybody time to work through their various beat echo issues. And just to make sure I'm not talking to the dead air, is everybody able to hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ignis.
I can hear you.
I'm not just one of the voices in your head. Okay, I think once Sue is able to reconcile her issues with being able to hear us, we can get started. Okay, Sue says that we should just go ahead and get started. Thank you all for your patience and waiting as we are working through our stuff. So this is the IDR interim on BGP auto configuration. So the intent is to run this very similar to the flow spec interim we just had. We have roughly 10 minutes worth of slides. That's current status and current thinking on things. And then the purpose for the remainder of the interim is to have good discussion about the contents and try to see if we can achieve a consensus from there. Prior to me flipping slides, is everybody able to see the slides at good resolution? Thank you, Ignis and Alvaro. Okay, so our agenda is talk about the scope of our discussion, what state we're going to probably want to carry in the protocol, the transport and BGP protocol considerations for that, what protocols do we end up creating from this state, and the security considerations for that protocol. So just a reminder, our initial focus is on data center scenarios. And while we note that most of the state is probably going to be the same for other non-data center scenarios, some scenarios such as multi-hop BGP might require additional auto-discovery state, those examples, TTL, MTU discovery, etc. So one of the things to have in mind as we're discussing the state and potentially extension mechanisms is how much is likely to be common plumbing from one scenario to the other, and after that, what level of extensibility might we need, both in terms of additional state and maybe changes in security scenarios as well. So this is largely the same slide that was presented at the last IETF. It was a summary from the auto configuration design team, and this is where a lot of our discussion happened on the mailing list. Just as a review, the session state that BGP needs to get a BGP session to come up is you need your IP addresses. You need to agree on whatever your transport security happens to be. You're seeing half-rendered slides. I'm doing it from a PDF viewer. Oh, sorry, I'm doing it from PowerPoint, so it should not be the problem. Let me try going full screen, see if that helps. Is this better for people? Okay, we'll see if this stays the same. And if anybody's having problems, these are exactly the same slides that are available in PDF form on the interim website, and I can paste the URL if we get stuck a little bit later there. So again, continuing transport security, we have to agree on what those things are going to be. So as an example, if you're using TCP MD5, AO, IPsec, or QUIC or something else, you need to actually agree on what those things are going to be for your IP transport to come up and bring up your session. If you're doing GTSM, you have to agree on that for the session to be able to come up. BFD is an interesting edge case. There are currently incompatible implementations about how BFD impacts your BGP session in the field. The BFD strict document that is an IDR is intended to address that point. So if BFD is getting used and you have inconsistency, your session won't survive. So this is a piece of state, but maybe it's a piece of state that goes away as part of other work. The second half of the story is just after you get your session up, or what you need to get the session up, there's a question of whether you want the session to come up in the first place. Whether the session is effectively acceptable to the thing that's discovering that session via the auto-discovery mechanism. The stuff that implementations will take a look at are things like AS numbers, potentially BGP identifier, especially for duplicate session detection if you happen to have things discovered at more than one layer. The list of address families that you're capable of peering at. Maybe you don't want to peer with a given session that's only advertising itself as v4 when a v6 session might be what you're looking to peer with. A very contentious bit of discussion is whether a device role in some flavor, is a discovery mechanism would be useful. Examples of that, if you were building a BGP fabric, using standard flow topology, knowing the position of your device or a discovered device inside of the fabric may help you choose whether or not you want to peer with it. What that actually looks like was left for future discussion. And part of this was, how do we do discussion extensions? A big portion of the discussion that we had as part of the list traffic after we published was that the session protocol state is somewhat contentious. You can get it potentially via the auto discovery protocol. You could also, as many people point out, get it discovered via BGP open. So an advantage is that prevents potentially conflicting state. But it does mean the only way for a client to figure out if you have an acceptable peer is to try to connect. And this has a couple of interesting impacts in terms of scale and just generally the ecosystem that auto discovery works on. So an example is, how fast do you try to connect after you do a discovery? How often you try to reconnect if you decide that first time I've learned a piece of configuration state from the session that I don't like, maybe it's changed. How do I figure that out? So if we allow things like the standard BGP timers to run, this means that you are constantly beating up on a given device. For some people pointed out data center style scale, that's not a large number of sessions. That's probably not terrifying, but it does potentially cause us to have additional considerations as we're working our way. Kair is messaging me that he's struggling in as well, so we may have many people with the same issues. But how often you're trying to retry becomes part of the problem. And there's also the fact that if you do allow BGP session to get established in any flavor, it means that resources get allocated. So where you terminate your discovery for the BGP session, if you're using BGP itself, can be very important. You probably want to terminate the session before it is established, just to make sure that you're not doing things like causing the ribs to spool up. Transport considerations are probably our biggest thing. As we talked about in the prior slides, you need to know the endpoints, GTSM, authentication, and the BFD state. In terms of the plumbing for BGP, effectively BGP, once it has an auto discovery mechanism present, it can be treated as a manual start from the existing state machine. This does mean that we have to discover. Jared, so if you're continuing to have slide issues, let me try presenting from PDF. And again, these slides are all present on the data tracker, for the session. One moment, please. And loading from the PDF to see if this is any better. Okay, I'm resuming at the slide labeled Transport and BGP Protocol Considerations. And even on my side, I'm now seeing it is sliced up. So MeetEcho is not having a great day. And toggle it out to full screen to see if that helps. I'm going to try sharing the application and see if that's any better. Okay, this is sharing the individual application, and we'll see if this helps at all. Okay. So the interaction with the state machine is an interesting set of questions that hasn't gotten a lot of discussion outside of the design team. So sure, you can just simply consider BGP having been prodded with a manual start event. However, we probably don't want for actual discovery scenarios to rely on exactly the state machine as specified. So things like timers probably are things that people want to make more aggressive. If you discover something and you're trying to build a fabric out of it, you don't want to wait 30 to 90 seconds for your connect retry timer, especially if it's hit back off mode, to try to reconnect. So there's going to be changes likely in timers. There's also going to be potentially changes in how often we do retry. And a lot of this maybe at scale for data centers doesn't matter, but as you start scaling up for any large radix, it starts to become an interesting problem. And as I mentioned, depending on your implementation, most implementations tend to wait till you get to established before you have problems with spooling up resources that might have to get instantly freed up if you disconnect rapidly. So once we've actually decided on our protocol state, what sort of protocols do we actually create from this stuff? The general consensus that we seem to have arrived at is we probably want, especially for data center environments, some sort of layer 2 mechanism. It doesn't route. You can tell instantly that's on the same link, and the security and privacy considerations are potentially very constrained. For any other scenario outside data centers, and potentially even including data centers, probably a layer 3 mechanism, and it likely will require some flavor of multicast. This does also change the security. And our last slide, our security considerations are going to be an important thing. A key point that's been made over and over, auto discovery does not bypass our BGP security mechanisms. So everything that we have securing BGP is still present. This just means that we have to have things advertised in the protocol that lets those things actually work. It does mean that if we have an auto discovery mechanism, we potentially have something that can aggressively trigger BGP connection attempts. And this means that at scale, we have a potential denial of service mechanism. And this is something that the security ADs would like us to have taken care of. And one of the other things is our security ADs will very likely require some level of information attached to discovery protocol that provides minimal authentication and some level of integrity. And certainly, it's a common practice, even when you're specifying such things, that one profile for that may actually be null. In most cases, it's likely to be some sort of shared secret, and whether or not there's a mechanism on there to allow the packets to be stamped with a nonce to make sure that you don't have replay, that's likely part of the discussion. And we have several techniques that are well deployed for it that is not a problem. The one last thing I'd like to leave with before we actually jump back to the actual discussion, as we were discussing in the list, the discovered open mechanisms, the main consideration for learning all the state is discovered open is how aggressive you're able to try to get the stuff and how long you may care to remember it based on your timers. A potential mechanism that lets us avoid beating up on the receiving peer is we include as part of the session state a version number, sequence number, nonce, pick whatever the appropriate term is that we derive at, that's lets you know that the session's configuration has changed. It makes sense for you to try again. So this potentially provides us a much lighter weight piece of state that can be carried in the protocol that still lets us largely use discovered open. And those are the chair slides. I'm going to cycle back to, this is our discussion slide. If anybody would like us to flip to a specific one, please let me know. But at this point, that's the chair's presentation. The floor is open for discussion. And while we're waiting for the first speaker, Kayer, would you mind testing your microphone? Okay, we seem to be having generally bad luck. No, Kayer, we're not able to hear you. You haven't shared your mic yet. Randy, please go
Sue
ahead.
seems to have disappeared.
Yeah, she hasn't pinged me back either yet.
Their discovery protocol.
Mhm. So given the number of problems, one thing we may want to reconsider is whether we should cancel the session and attempt to try again later, maybe with a different technology. Okay, you're sharing
Jeff,
your
good
microphone.
morning. Can you
Good
hear
morning,
me?
Kayer. We can.
Super.
Can you hear us, Kayer?
Good morning, folks. Yes.
Excellent.
Are there people unable to join? The number of people here is not large. If that's the case, then we have a real problem.
Yeah, we're seeing most of the participants we were expecting for this interim. So we have Sue. Sue, do you care to try to talk again?
I'll just comment. It was incredibly difficult to find the link.
Okay, it's one of the well-advertised links off the interim page. I guess for the future, we'll make sure to do a copy and paste of the actual Join Me Deco link.
Yeah, it's odd because you could hear Care for a minute.
Jeff, this is Sue. Can you hear me?
So we can hear you. Can you hear us?
A little bit of challenge. A reboot on the system always works well. Thank you.
Okay. So the primary reason to have had this interim was we hadn't quite reached consensus during the discussion on the mailing list. The consensus that we did seem to eventually get to is that the items that are labeled session protocol state very likely do not belong in the protocol. And we discussed that we potentially could replace that with a version number that gives the receiving auto-discovery peer a hint that something's changed, and please reconnect to gather that information. So there's really two questions open for the interim from the chair's perspective. Question number one, with the required information that we have here, plus potentially some way of noticing that the session protocol state has changed, along with the other considerations that we have in there for things like security and the transport implications, do we have sufficient consensus to move forward? Randy.
This seems to say that you do not need the AS number to open.
That is correct.
You know,
The discussion point that we had is that all that information can come from the remote PHP peer as part of no connection time.
but
Linda.
today
Sorry,
I
Randy, please.
need it. To open,
Oh,
I
that
need
I remember
to
back in
open.
January, February when we discussed this auto configuration, there were like 4 different approaches, right? There's layer 2 approach. There's using IGP to distribute information. So I'm a little confused on this. Why do we have to worry about the TCP session? I'm just a little maybe cannot link the two together. Do we still consider like the layer 2 LLDP kind of peer discovery?
So to answer your question, Linda, each of the protocol examples that we had were a way to distribute information to allow BGP to come up. So whether that's LODP, the mechanism from Xiaohu, the IGP mechanism that AC had for discovering route reflectors, this is all about discovering that there's a BGP peer present. The fundamental question, and this is the purpose of this slide, is regardless of which protocol you use, there's a minimal set of information that you have to bring up a peering session and actually do the work of connecting to something that has been discovered. So the stuff that's highlighted for the session transport, if you're told by LODP as an example that there's a BGP peer there, you need to know what its addresses are. You need to know what security is, and these are all things that, in order for BGP to even send an open message, you have to know what those things are. And if you're running at a layer 3 type protocol, there is some potential that the layer 3 header information might provide you an endpoint hint, but that's information that's effectively part of the protocol. Whether that's part of the PDU or that's part of the IP header is sort of a implementation point.
So is it appropriate to say that those information have to be present? That means all the 4 like how many proposals we had? We had like 5 different drafts, right? I remember. Make sure each of them must be able to derive those information through whatever protocol they propose. Is that the goal?
That is the goal, and part of it was we had a bunch of proposals that didn't talk about what was minimally required, and it turned out that when we analyzed most of the protocols, that analysis is in the appendix for the design team document. A lot of them came up with a lot of consistent ideas. So hitting back to a point that Randy was raising, AS number, yes, you do need that to bring up the session, but mostly you need it to determine if the session is acceptable. So as an example, if my discovery mechanism tells me I have a possible peer at 10.1.1.1, and I want to decide if I'm going to peer with it, what do I care about? Well, I need to get my BGP session up, so that's getting a TCP session to port 179 running. And then at that point, it's going to send me an open message, and I'm going to send it an open message. Part of that through normal BGP is deciding, is this acceptable? As Randy was, I think, leaning towards, normal BGP configuration, I'm going to say that I have a neighbor 10.1.1.1 at AS100. That's part of my configuration, and it has to have some matching configuration that decides whether it likes my peering session or not. But for auto discovery purposes, maybe I don't need to know that it's AS100, especially if it's a fabric. I may just care that it's a peer of some sort. I will learn from it that it's AS100 and then decide at that point whether I want to hang up the phone or continue connecting.
Okay, thank you.
Randy, did you want to make a follow-up point before we went to Cossack?
you used some funny terms in there, deciding whether you want to make a connection, etc. Could we stick with the discovery and open? And if you need more terms, fine, but what do I need to issue the open? Right? The
That
protocol
information is on the left-hand side.
and you do not need AS to successfully open.
Remember that the open that we send are our local parameters. We don't care about the remote AS is for sending an open.
I'm going to have to read more.
Okay. Yeah, the BGP protocol procedure, you care about just advertising for your end.
Do you disagree with Jeff's assertion here? That
I
you don't
claim
need.
insufficient reading to agree or disagree. I need to go back and read more.
Okay, super. Thanks.
Kosik, you're next in queue. And Kosik, you have to hit the microphone button to be able to speak. Okay, well, we're waiting for Kosik. Ketan.
Yeah, I think so. Okay.
We can hear
Jeff, yeah, thanks. Jeff, did I hear you mention that instead of these session protocol state parameters that we have something like a profile ID or some some identifier or some tag or whatever being exchanged instead of all these parameters to help perhaps the receiving router do some kind of checking or validation before it even allows the connect.
So where I've been speaking of that, so I'm going to leave out device role as one of the qualifiers for that, but just sticking the standard RFC 4271 BGP. Now we actually care that we can bring up a TCP session, and then the BGP state machine gets kicked off. As part of the open messages, we're going to exchange our BGP identifiers, which are effectively router IDs. We're also going to exchange capabilities, gives us the AFI-SAFIs, and we're also going to exchange our AS numbers. So as part of that procedure, literally the state machine basically has a acceptability procedure.
Yeah, correct. However, when when the session is let's say connect is triggered, what I may have as a router, I may have different profiles, right? I may have one profile to, let's say, connect to the compute nodes or the servers or something like that. I may have a different profile up towards the fabric. Taking a data center example, even to do the connect, would I not need to have some, like, which profile do I use to do the connect from my side?
That is a relevant point. You're not incorrect, but it's a matter of applicability rather than what the auto discovery has to have. So this is where the discussion for device role was part of the reason why it ended up in the requirements and unfortunately became contentious. If you think about your configuration for standard BGP that's been configured by your CLI as an example, you know exactly what's on the other side, and therefore you know what peer group it goes into, which has things like my policy. For auto-discovered roles, in many cases, if it's one thing that's at the other side of an interface, you're probably still going to, in your configuration, say that this auto-discovery is going to be attached to a peer group of some sort for a specific purpose.
Correct. Yep.
So in that case, the configuration still is present. The
Except-
configuration just simply becomes discovered, at this interface.
Okay. Yeah. What I'm getting is that we really don't need that. It's something that would come from possibly from the interface.
Potentially so. So working from the data sorter example that we were discussing during the design team discussions, consider like a simple BGP fabric. If you're doing a standard fabric from the RFC, your leaf nodes all have individual AS numbers. Your aggregation layer, you'll usually have a single AS number, and then your spine layer will have a different AS number than that. And part of the problem is if you just say peer with the thing that's at the other side of the link and I don't care what it is, well, certainly the profile needs to change. You actually do care for building a fabric where you are.
Correct. Yeah.
So the question becomes, even if you have discovery, what do you use for acceptability of the accession? So as an example, if I'm a leaf node and I want to peer with my aggregation node, basically I have an acceptable AS list. I'm willing to peer with anybody that is this AS number. You may still have misconnectivity in terms of where you are in the radix for the switch itself, but you're not going to end up with loops or other broken BGP. So this does mean that even in the presence of auto discovery, there's still going to be some sort of mechanisms implemented on the routers to actually say a session is acceptable or not. And that's partially, what I was getting at with Randy. If you have that AS number, you know whether you're going to want to peer with this or not. If I have the identifier and I have the potential from more than one discovery mechanism, maybe I prefer one transport like V4 versus V6 versus the other. So there is an acceptability criteria very likely.
Okay. So so if I were to kind of try to paraphrase it, the profile on the router which it is supposed to use for the open is determined by, let's say, what is associated with the specific interface. After that, all the other validation or role or whatever it may be would be part of the, let's say, the BGP negotiation. So if we want further extensions or to add something to that, we would kind of be doing it as part of the BGP protocol. Is that a fair summary?
It's a fair summary, although it's sort of open discussion. So
Okay.
the
Okay.
example
Yeah. Okay. So far. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
That's what I get so far. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. And just to conclude that point, part of the motivation for device role is, again, going back to the fabric. If you're dealing with a large set of leaf ASs, as long as your entire fabric knows what the AS set is and what the individual roles are, the acceptability checks can be built in just simply as a access list on AS numbers. But if you want to try to have a little bit easier mode where you don't want to have to be continuously reprovisioning the AS numbers for the leaves, potentially just simply saying this is a leaf role is sufficient. But that was, again, a little contentious. Kayer, you have the microphone.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Super. Speaking as a working group member, I do agree to the last line what Ketan said. Anything that is deemed capabilities should go into the open message. More as an FYI to the earlier conversation that you and Randy were having, misconfigurations of the wires are very common in data center. And so one of the reasons within LSVR for L3DL, where we carried what an expected AS number on the other side from the peering is inside the discovery message, so that we wanted discovery message to fail as soon as you figure out that the expectation is not matched. Thank you.
Thanks. And that really was, flipping to the other slide. A lot of our discussion that we had on the mailing list about whether or not discover and open was good or not, and things can work perfectly fine. I think even like your LSVR scenarios, if you had omitted the AS number, you'd bring up the connection and then decide you'd have to hang up, very soon, and then you're back to retry mechanisms afterwards.
And we were trying to nip that part upon a startup because in a lot of cases, convergence and how fast you bring up the sessions and how fast you converge um, are of an importance. So we wanted to nip that as fast as part of the discovery message and let the operators know that you have a misconfiguration in place. Thank you.
Thank you. Kaushik, care to try again?
Yes. Can you hear me, Jeff?
We can't hear you.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that earlier. So now looks like it is connected. Yeah, so I was kind of trying to extend what Linda was asking. And so now we have that two L2 protocols, part of this discovery, and two L3 protocols now, and we have kind of specified the requirements, part of this auto discovery mechanism. My question is, how do we go from here? Like, do we need the changes kind of needed on the protocol side? Would that be a next step?
That is absolutely the next step. We had failed to reach consensus the first round of whether this is even the right state. There is a lot of discussion about that. Once we actually do agree that's the right state, the next question is, what protocols do we do?
Right.
And the draft actually does a comparison of the proposals that we have on the board. As you mentioned, we have two different L2 protocols, and I'm going to call them 2.5 to 3 L3 protocols. And part of the analysis that we did for the design team work was to say, if these things are the state that we care about, what needs to change in each of the proposals to take care of that? For the most part, it's either add a little bit of information or potentially change where the information is present. There's also discussions about what level of statefulness the protocol itself may want to have. So as an example, the LLDP mechanism is just simply broadcast, but it's not very frequent based on the definition of the protocol that they have in IEEE. LSOE has the mechanism that is effectively, to some extent, an advertisement, but its intent is to build a session. And the case of the L3 protocols, we basically have, like Xiaohu's draft is effectively LDP hello mechanism for BGP. That one is actually building a full session rather than just simply a hello protocol, I'm there. So that one actually involves a level of statefulness, which we may or may not want. Robert's partial solution effectively is just basically BGP open inside a multicast. There's not quite enough information and ability to handle some of the state in that proposal, but that's an example of minimal state just simply going into a packet.
So question is like, do we kind of plan to work in all the protocols, like this part of this auto discovery mechanism, what is proposed, that if we needed to be extended for the L2 and L3 for all the protocols, we kind of try to now extend, or like minimally we kind of that would be a kind of viable recommendations, we kind of take 2 or just all the protocols. That's what I was kind of trying to get in, like what would be the priority?
Well, my expectation, and this is one that will require broader input from the rest of the chairs, is that we'll very likely want a L2 mechanism, that IDR decides to adopt, and a L3 mechanism. Okay. So very likely what would happen is if we agree that this is a state, we've now got information we can send back each of the authors of the various proposals to say, here's what we think the mechanism should have, please update your proposal to cover that, and then the working group can decide as part of adoption phases and discussion what we want to do, and that may be pick an updated version of one of the existing proposals, or perhaps we draft a new one.
Got it.
So
Thank you.
this is the important part, Kasik, is that we agree on what we absolutely need. Perhaps to quote other people, Donald and Randy, it's the minimum amount of state we need for the data center. And then if we go beyond the data center, what's the minimum state we need for a different use case? Maybe it's use case on an exchange point. We need to
Correct.
agree on this, and then we can start providing this. So do you agree that we have the
No, I
correct
absolutely agree, because what you mentioned, that's once we kind of verbally agree, and that's what I was kind of getting into that part. Like then based on that, we kind of extend that auto discovery mechanism for the IXP exchange points, right? Like so, this is the kind of point, like which one we kind of agree on, and how do we kind of extend from there beyond data centers. Yeah, absolutely agree. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Sue.
Okay.
Thanks, Kaushik.
Jeff, since I missed a portion of it, did we have anyone who disagreed with the BGP transport state or the session state? Did we do that call?
Nobody specifically objected to the session transport state. The session protocol state, Randy has some questions about the AS number, which you did actually hear.
So that's our real goal, folks, for this, is to get some sort of consensus. So I'll make a specific call. Is there anybody on this discussion point that feels these either BGP session transport state or the session protocol state we have listed is not what's needed? Shall we leave out device control? What can we lean down?
Randy, you have the mic.
I did my reading. I agree with your slide. By the way, this is Randy Bush, IIJ Research and ARCIS.
Thank you, Randy. So a question that I have explicitly to the people on the call, as we discussed, you can actually pick up everything that is in session protocol state from the BGP message. We've also discussed on the list, and I've reviewed it here, that having some sort of hint that the session protocol state information can be put into the protocol, so we can avoid having to ask, open up the BGP session over and over again to see if something's changed. Kara gave an example in LSOE about why they actually do the AS number present in there. Would there be any objection to having some sort of hint that the session protocol state has been updated? Randy, you have the mic.
Is this after a successful open? Again, Randy Bush, ARCIS, IIJ. Sorry.
So it would be part of the session discovery state. Let me give an explicit example what this would look like. Just at least my thinking.
No, but are you saying the parameters are changing after the successful open? I'm supposed to notify you? Or is the discovery done, the open, and during discovery things can change, and we finally successfully open? We do not further change the parameters using the discovery protocol, ?
Okay, to be very explicit, from the slide, the session transport state remains stable. We have a let's call it configuration version number, just to have a proposal. And that starts off as 1. And you don't know anything about session protocol state. So you connect to the device you've discovered, and then you see that, well, its AS number is 100. It's like, well, 100 is not who I expect to connect to. The question becomes, do you want to try again at some point? Could the operator maybe change something that maybe makes that an acceptable connection? Maybe they had a misconfiguration. If so, how would you tell? And certainly one way to do it is simply to just let your BGP timer try again in 30 to 90 seconds to say, does this become acceptable at some point? An alternate mechanism is that configuration version gets bumped. It's no longer 1. You had remembered that 1 was not acceptable. It becomes 2. Then you connect to it and you see that something's changed, and then you can maybe change your mind and decide that it's now acceptable to connect to it, or maybe not. But you don't need to necessarily let your BGP retry timers fire over and over again. So that's the intent of a version or generation or nonce. We'll have to have discussion about what the actual name of such a thing would be. Ketan, you have the mic.
I think that is fair. However, it does expose. I think you also mentioned it during the initial part of somebody just keeping on trying stuff, just to and the router, let's say, would have to just keep retrying, not at its normal retry period, but faster, and just keep failing over and over again as somebody increments this nonce, because we don't have the actual info passed. It just, I think you mentioned, that's the one. So we'll have to capture that somehow.
Absolutely, and those are considerations that the security ADs will definitely, at the very least, want us to discuss, if not solve. In the grand scheme of transport attacks, BGP is not going to ever be terribly fast at this sort of thing. Just that those of us who've written BGP implementations know that they can be very sensitive to sessions coming up and down, even if they don't really do anything.
Correct. Yeah. Thanks.
So some level of information signed across the security portion of the discovery protocol probably will need to be there to help you avoid some sort of misleading attacks. And again, the attack space will differ depending whether you're in a layer 2 environment where everything is directly attached versus layer 3. The one place that's an interesting hybrid of the two problems is like a internet exchange point. Okay, you have the mic.
I was going to say exactly that, Jeff, and that this is where the implementations will kick in and do appropriate state settlement and pacing if needed, so as to take and neutralize the nonce bump.
So, okay, to ask an explicit question, because you have LSOE serving LSVR, you've mentioned how you have the AS number in there to help you avoid forming inappropriate sessions, but LSOE also has like part of the other information for the session present, but not all of it. What sort of mechanisms do you have in your implementation to decide whether you're going to retry something if you think it's acceptable and the session just doesn't come up for some reason?
So one example, particularly in context of AS change, is if I receive a LSOE update from you and I don't expect the AS number that I'm seeing from you, I will not initiate a BGP session. As and when I see an update from you with a right AS number, I go up to the BGP, register that, and say now is the time to open up the session. And I mark that change with an appropriate timestamp to let the operators know, hey, at time T, I actually received a write update, and at T plus so many milliseconds, I started initiating the session. Yeah, so that's a good way to sort of pace and actually eliminate session initialization till the right set of information is received.
Okay, and timer-wise, how aggressive is the implementation in trying to connect?
I think LSOE updates are sent every 60 seconds. Randy can correct me.
I forget that number, but the point is that it's tunable. So if you expect open failures and you want to receive those updates quickly, then, run your LSOE updates with higher frequency. My memory is 30 seconds, but my memory is notoriously bad. But I think the underlying point is you only retry when you get new information, and you can tune that.
Okay, that's actually a nice supporting point towards the version number we were discussing earlier.
But that's LSOE's particular setup for LSVR and SPF. There are a number of changes I would think about for the IDR scenario. So I'm not, at least in my head, bound to the LSVR definition, or maybe we'll learn things here that should go back there. But I'm sorry. You were trying to say something?
I was about to ask if you had anything specific in mind.
You seem attached to, by the way, excuse my use of the word you, IDR seems to be attached to thinking they're going to codify the attributes, its location in the mesh, etc. Instead of LSVR, it's just arbitrary attributes. There's the whole expecting very large sets to be transported. I don't know if you need that. Do you really need to be able to carry, to be able to get 10,000 attributes in 10,000 possible peers in a whack? But I think that's, I don't know if you want to go down that rabbit hole. My point's more to what you were discussing, which is what you need to succeed with BGP with reasonable convergence. And I think those are just tunings. And I note that LSVR does have L3DL does have a concept of a time. It has not just the session number, it has the transport blob number.
Okay, and I will actually own towards being the you in the question for device role. That's an idea that I've seen discussed and generally supportive of, partially because for some of the easy mode scenarios, it does potentially have the chance to help.
LSOE has something you can use for device role. It's just completely agnostic about it. There's a set of attributes you can, local policy says what are the semantics and values behind those attributes.
And that at least is my personal intent as well. Have some well-defined numbers that can be used in common scenarios, and past that point, it's just an arbitrary thing, much like a BGP community that you could write policy on to say a session's acceptable or not. But again, as we discussed at the beginning, we don't necessarily need that as the core thing. It can literally be an optional extension, and we just have to make sure that there's room for extensions. The sort of toward your other point, worrying about carrying a large number of things, it's more a matter of figuring out completeness of the solution. And since the state might be carried in various mechanisms that you may not have a lot of space, we do have to understand what the critical piece of information is, as you're talking about, and also potential fragmentation of that state if necessary. L3DL does actually a nice job of that fragmentation.
As to the device role attributes, I did not have the hubris to think I could come up with a clearly delineated, this is what we should standardize, and everything beyond there, well, we'll leave that for future. But, you've got more time in the cockpit on this, so I bow to your wisdom.
Need to sort of unpack as far as requirements, folks. Device role or some sort of hint here, as Jeff mentioned, can be left as a future extension, can be placed in this original piece. Randy's given you his, gee, we don't really know what we want to put there. The other flip side of the discussion we've heard is people want some basics. So we'd really like some feedback, because we've heard whispers about both, but we really need to try to decide if it's going to be in there. And if it's not, we need to see how we should add it on a future extension.
Randy, you have the mic.
I think if you ask,
5 miles down the pike, when you're trying to use this in an environment other than data center, it's going to look a little silly to have a lot of data center attributes. But I don't really have a dog in this fight.
Okay, here you have the mic.
yes, thanks. I was going to say that over and beyond data centers, Jeff, it absolutely makes sense when you start to talk about roles in context of, say, for example, is the router in the forwarding path, i.e. the route reflector versus a core or an edge router, right? Or a CPE. And these roles would start to make a lot more value.
Right. We may end up moving from device role to more general informational TLVs. And that's where the conversation, I think Randy and Robert both motivated. When you can't explicitly know what the roles are, and some of these roles may be inappropriate for some environments, sure, they're just numbers that are occupying a namespace. But end of the day, what you want is some ability to have numbers that you can talk about in a useful way in your implementation. Sue?
Points that Jeff and Randy and Care have made. The question that I'm sort of as a moderator saying, Are we okay with this as a future extension? Should it be now and left sort of TLVs? Doesn't matter, so that we can sort of close these off. And do we foresee in device roles things that L3 VPN or BEST might be wanting to use to create different things? Just going to ask the participants if we can get any feedback.
Ketan, you have the mic.
Frank, so go ahead, Ketan.
I think the moment we expand its applicability, any number of things may or could potentially come up. So, yeah, I think having some degree of extensibility would be good, but I guess doing it with BGP as part of the open or capability is probably a better way to do that for an expanded role kind of a thing or deployment. Here in the data center, we're talking probably more like link local or layer 2. So yeah, for other profiles, doing it in BGP would be my suggestion.
Okay. Building on your point, Ketan, one of the discussion points we did have as part of this is, when would some of this optional information be more appropriate for the discovery protocol versus the BGP session, as a capability, you should give it as an example. And we mostly have gone down the path of, maybe the version hint as a way of determining whether you should reconnect to get information is a perfectly fine way to do that. The related other point is, at what point is information inside of the capabilities just noise to BGP itself? Does anything besides discovery mechanism and the thing that lets you plug policy into that really care? Probably one of the biggest things that would make us lean that direction that's come out of the discussion for the design team is about message size. In many cases, we're trying to stick this discovery information potentially piggybacking into other protocol PDUs that may not have a lot of space. The example is LODP. So having an extension mechanism that's mostly discover at BGP open allows us to not worry about that problem quite so much. Ketan, you're first.
More extensible and for other use cases and deployments. I agree with that.
Randy?
JRCS, we'll never need more than 640K attributes. That was too obscure. It's when we limit ourselves to the space in current technology, like 640K IBM PCs back in the day, we live to regret it.
Okay. Any further discussion about the protocol state? And I'm going to explicitly call out Robert, because Robert did actually make a lot of the substantial comments that got us to the point of taking the session protocol state out. Robert says he can't unmute. You should just have to poke the microphone button at the top right of the panel. So Robert, there's also a resync button at the bottom right that says reconnect audio. Why don't you try that? And we'll pause long enough for you to do that. Okay, Robert, if you care to type, I'm happy to channel back to the audio. The question, Robert, specifically was a good portion of the discussion about what belongs into the state, the required session transport state, and the stuff on the slide that's labeled session protocol state, and how much should be done as discovered open, was motivated by conversations you initiated. Are you happy with things with what we're suggesting, which is session protocol state moves into discovered open, potentially with a version number so that we know whether to recheck or not? No, the BFD is not a typo. This is potentially a point we should address separately. BFD is, I mentioned, you can't have a PHP session survive, with a couple of implementations because they fight over when the BFD applies to the PHP state machinery. There is a draft. Let me go ahead and highlight it. A moment, please. I think I had it in there. Yeah, here we go. There is a draft that is adopted by IDR, BFD strict, which gets rid of this ambiguity in when the state machine is applied. If we just basically say that any solutions using auto-discovery, if BFD is going to be in use, this extension is expected to be implemented. This is a piece of state that can drop out of the discovery mechanism. Sorry, Robert, your text question is not clear. Returning here. Sorry. Yeah, you're correct. This is not well stated. So this would be BFD configuration, if any, should be period. No problem, Robert. Clearly, we're not having a good Mineko morning. So just to be clear, you have no objections? Okay, Robert says no. So again, I'd like to leave the question open just for a moment to see if anybody has further feedback. And if not, my proposal for the people on this call, several of which were on the design team, is that the design team document is updated to make sure these things are clear in terms of what we think the required transport state is, that the session protocol state would be discovered via PHP open, that we'd provide a hint inside of the auto discovery protocol that the version has changed and you need to check again, and that we do want to have some ability in the discovery protocol to have extensions for the future. And at that point, we'd probably be taking the design team draft back to the working group and repeating and hopefully concluding the adoption. The process afterwards, if that's true, is it becomes effectively a archived document, and the next stage is to move on to implementations.
Implementations, just to provide some support for Jeff, is that we close off on this design document and then immediately open discussions on proposals. So we anticipate closing off on the design document, having an adoption call before IETF, and then, if you have something you think you really want to start proposing based on these concepts, to go ahead and start taking proposals. We won't block those once we make this second call. We're trying to go through that fairly quickly, seeing we're not seeing much debate. Jeff, I've lost your screen. Is that me, or is that just a lack? Are we having another Meet Echo moment? New screen. Thank you, Jeff. Okay. So folks, we're going to ask one more call. Operators, if you're working with operations, tell us if there's some problem. Just as you saw the flow spec, we'll probably summarize this meeting and then ask for comments and then take it into another adoption. So we'll open it one more time. Any calls? Any concerns? Any last words before we close the session?
So Alvaro had mentioned that he was going to be having homework happen around him and may not easily be able to come to the microphone. But Alvaro, this is your time to speak if you have any comments.
Hey, Jeff. No, I don't really have any comments. The discussion seems to be going well, and the next steps that you guys outlined seem fine to me. So, no, thank you.
Thank you.
Close off on this topic. I did send out an email that gave our summation of the flow spec discussion. Did anyone want to add anything to that discussion that we might provide some additional discussion time here? Wow, we might just have a wrap, Jeff and Care. I think, Jeff, then any closing comments you have, and then we'll call it an afternoon.
I have no further comments. I will attempt to take the notes here and update the internet draft, circulate among the design team, and hopefully ship a 0-1 for that by end of week.
Super. I will probably try to get the minutes out. You should be able to watch the Meet Echo within a day. Once I do that, G's connection wasn't really good to take notes, so we'll take notes once we see the Meet Echoes. Please let us know these longer sessions. We may have some additional ones. Some of them will be general working group listening sessions, and some of them will be very targeted on drafts. What we're finding is with the new virtual environment, we've got to take these listening sessions off the ITF meetings and stay to just sort of presentations and short bursts. So you may see some more of these. These two were general. If I have a specific to a draft, we'll call it something like an interim that's for a specific draft. With that, we'll thank you very much. And I thank Jeff for all of his presentation. And thank you again.
Okay. And very
Have a
briefly,
great day.
Ketan is asking on chat, is the document already a working group document? You are correctly observing that is labeled as if it is, but that's because I mispublished it. No, it is not cleared working group adoption, even though it has that name. If we decided it was not going to be a working group document, then I would have put out a tombstone that said that we did not actually reach consensus. Okay, Ketan seems to have his question answered. Thank you, everyone, and we'll talk to you all later.
Thank you.